At first light, the land was still, the cool air hanging low over the tall grass. The silence was broken not by the stirring of birds or the call of antelope, but by a sound more strained, a fractured cry that carried on the wind. It was the kind of sound that unsettled even the calm of the morning, raw, wounded, and heavy with exhaustion. Those who heard it paused, uncertain, for it was neither the roar of strength nor the low growl of warning. It was something different, a voice of suffering hidden in the folds of the savannah. The rangers followed the sound with careful steps, their boots sinking softly into damp earth. Each call grew quieter as they neared, as though the source of it no longer had the strength to cry out. And then, through a break in the grass, they saw him. A lion, great and golden, his mane dulled with dust, lay pressed to the earth as if it had swallowed him. His flank rose and fell in shallow rhythm. His paw, the great instrument of his survival, was locked cruelly in a wire snare that cut deep into the flesh. He had struggled. The ground around him told the story, soil torn by claws, grass flattened in circles, blood darkening the roots. The more he had fought, the tighter the wire had drawn, until the weight of his own power turned against him. Now his body was stretched with fatigue, his chest heaving with shallow breaths. He lifted his head at their approach, eyes wide with a mixture of pain and wary strength, and then lowered it again, as though the act itself had cost him too much. The air held its breath. No one moved closer at first. The rangers knew too well the danger of an injured predator. Even weakened, the lion's power lingered in every line of his body, his shoulders taut, his jaw heavy. The silence stretched, broken only by the rustle of grass and the faint metallic clink when he tried to pull against the snare again. The sound was softer now, not the violent thrashing of hours before, but a quiet tug, a gesture almost resigned. The landscape around them seemed to sharpen with the weight of the moment. A pair of oxpeckers circled and landed near his back, their small beaks tugging gently at his fur, unbothered by his stillness. The morning sun had begun its climb, spilling light across the open grassland, but it did not touch him with warmth. He lay in shadow, half hidden in the tall stalks, a king reduced to silence by a strand of wire. One of the men whispered, almost to himself, "Easy now, we see you." His words were barely more than breath, carried off by the breeze. Still, the sound seemed to settle the air, a small note of calm in the tension that held both human and lion still. The lion's ears flicked, his tail, dusted and limp, gave one slow movement across the ground. His body told a story that words never could, the shift between defiance and exhaustion, the way his gaze followed them without fire, only with a heavy, reluctant acceptance. The trap, likely set for smaller game, had found him instead. It had caught not just a paw, but an entire life in its grip, his hunting, his roaming, his role in the quiet order of the land. Around him the wilderness went on as if untouched, birds calling overhead, insects busy in the grass. Yet here lay one of its greatest, undone by a single loop of wire. The men stood still a while longer, the weight of choice pressing against the morning silence. The lion's cry had led them here, but the decision of what to do next was theirs alone. The animal's body shifted faintly, a sigh escaping his chest, as though he too waited for what would come. And as the sun rose higher, the world seemed to hold him in a fragile balance, a creature built for power, brought low by human hand, lying in the grass between danger and trust, between despair and the faint glimmer of rescue. ChatGPT said the day grew older, and with it, the lion's battle deepened. His body had not given in easily. Again and again he had thrown his weight against the earth, dragging the wire in short, violent bursts, snapping the grass flat around him. Each movement had carried the strength of a creature built for dominance. But the trap was unyielding. Where his muscles strained, the wire cut deeper, biting until raw flesh showed against tawny fur. The soil bore the marks of his defiance, furrows dug in wide arcs, a map of desperation pressed into the land. By midday his energy faltered. He lay panting, his ribs shifting with each shallow breath, foam gathering at the corners of his mouth. His mane, once regal, clung to sweat and dust. The flies came in restless swarms, settling on the wound, scattered by a weak shake of his head only to return again. His eyes, half closed against the weight of exhaustion, opened when the wind shifted, and with a low rumble, he tried again to rise. The effort carried him only a few steps before the wire snapped taut, pulling him to the ground with a sound like dry grass tearing. His roar that followed was broken, less the voice of a ruler than the plea of a creature trapped between life and death. From a distance, people gathered. The nearest village had heard his cries through the night, and whispers carried among the huts. Some climbed low trees to glimpse him from afar. Others stood in clusters at the edge of the grass, careful not to step closer. Fear kept them back, fear of what a lion, even wounded, could still do. Yet worry pressed against that fear. Many here had lived beside lions their whole lives, respecting their presence, knowing the balance they held in the wild. To see one undone like this struck something deep, an unease that kept their eyes fixed even as their feet stayed rooted in place. The children asked questions in hushed tones, their words drifting through the group. The elders stayed silent, only watching. Every time the lion moved, the crowd leaned forward, holding breath, then settled again as he sank back down. His struggle had become a rhythm, effort, collapse, stillness, then effort again. Through the long afternoon, vultures circled high above, their dark shapes turning slow against the pale sky. Their patience was endless. They knew what stillness meant when it came at last. Below, the lion gave no sign of surrender, though his movements grew slower, his pauses longer. At times he pressed his head into the ground, eyes closed, as though the weight of his mane itself was too much to bear. Then, with sudden defiance, he would lift again, jaws snapping at the air, his paw dragging the trap until his whole body shuddered with pain. One man, standing apart from the others, whispered under his breath, "Stay with us." The words were not meant for the crowd, but for the great body in the grass. They were spoken quietly, as though loudness itself might tip the balance. As the sun tilted towards evening, the lion's breaths grew rougher. His flank rose with effort, then fell too slowly. Dust clung to his wounds, turning red to brown. The circle of watchers stayed where they were, bound by the same tension, unwilling to leave, yet too wary to draw near. In their stillness, the only movement was his, the rhythm of a creature caught between the will to live and the weight of his pain. The grass swayed around him, carrying the faint hum of crickets. Somewhere far away, another lion's call drifted across the plains, low and distant. This one did not answer. He lay quiet, only the occasional twitch of his ear or the flick of his tail showing that he still belonged to the living. The villagers watched, each moment a silent measure of how close he stood to the edge. The night would come soon, and with it, new dangers. But for now, the land seemed suspended in a fragile hush, a lion fighting against the invisible chain of human hands, a village waiting with helpless eyes, and the long grass bending gently as though to hide the struggle within it. Evening shadows stretched long across the grass when a decision was finally made. The lion's struggle had slowed to near stillness, his breaths shallow and ragged, his head resting heavily on the earth. Around him the crowd lingered, but it was one man who moved forward, leaving the safety of distance. His steps were measured, each one pressing into the soil as though the ground itself needed reassurance. He carried no weapon, only a length of wood for balance, and a pair of old cutters that hung loosely in his hand. The others watched in silence, their faces set with worry, knowing what such a choice meant. The lion stirred at the shift of movement. His ears twitched, his head lifting just enough to show the glint of his eyes. A low growl rolled from his chest, thin but warning. His tail flicked once against the dust, his muscles tightening in a ripple of tension. He had little strength left, but instinct remained sharp, every fibre of his body alert to the nearness of man. The wire at his paw glinted in the fading light, cutting deep into swollen flesh that throbbed with each movement. The man slowed his steps further, crouching slightly as he drew nearer. His body spoke caution, his hands open when they did not hold the cutter. He whispered softly, words no lion would understand, but the tone carried weight. "Easy now. It's all right." His voice was low, steady, a rhythm against the heavy silence. The lion answered with a faint snarl, the sound frayed, more a statement of fear than of rage. For a time the man stopped just a few paces away, waiting. The air felt fragile, each moment balanced between trust and sudden violence. The lion's eyes never left him, pupils wide, mane shifting in the breeze. When the great head lowered again, exhausted, the man moved one step closer, lowering himself until he too was near the ground. The cutters pressed against his leg as his fingers brushed the wire, testing its strength. The trap was cruelly tight. It had bitten so deep that the paw was swollen twice its size, the fur matted with dried blood. Each time the man touched the wire, the lion's muscles shuddered, a tremor running through his massive frame. The man paused often, whispering again, letting the animal feel his stillness before trying once more. The crowd at the edge of the grass held their breath, children clutching their mothers' skirts, elders silent with folded arms. Minutes passed this way. Touch, pause, retreat, return. The man worked carefully, sliding the metal jaws of the cutter into the narrow space between wire and flesh. The lion's paw twitched, claws extending weakly, his chest rumbling with warning. The man did not flinch. His movements were slow, deliberate, carrying no threat. The cutters bit into the wire with a faint crunch, loosening one edge but not yet breaking it. Sweat slid down the man's temple, catching the last light of day. Again the cutters pressed, again the pause, again the whisper. Almost there. His voice was quieter now, almost lost to the wind. The lion shifted his weight, a groan vibrating through him, then stilled once more. The man pressed harder, and this time the wire gave way with a muted snap. The lion flinched violently, pulling his paw free with a sudden jerk that sent dust rising. The man froze, his hands falling to his sides, his eyes fixed on the animal before him. For a heartbeat it seemed the lion might strike, his body tensed, jaws parting. But the moment passed as quickly as it rose. The great head lowered again, his chest heaving, his paw dragging limply against the ground. The wire, broken at last, curled useless in the grass. The man remained crouched, unmoving, his breath steady though his heart raced. The lion's growl faded into silence, his body trembling with the first taste of freedom. Around them the villagers began to murmur, but softly, as if unwilling to disturb what had just been given back. The light dimmed further, settling into the quiet of dusk. Man and lion stayed locked in stillness, bound not by wire now, but by the fragile thread of what had just been risked and what had been returned. The wire lay broken in the grass, a dull coil that no longer held power. The lion shifted his weight cautiously, dragging his injured paw toward his body. Blood marked the fur, the swelling thick and uneven, but the freedom was undeniable. He stretched his neck upward, pulling in deep breaths, the first he had taken without restraint in many days. The man stayed where he was, still crouched, his body quiet and low to the earth. The villagers behind him did not move either. Every eye was fixed on what would come next. For long moments, the lion remained on the ground, his chest rising and falling with heavy effort. His tail flicked across the dust, a restless motion that betrayed unease. Then, with a slow gathering of strength, he pushed against the soil, muscles straining as he tried to rise. His first attempt failed, and he sank back with a grunt, the paw trembling beneath him. But he tried again, a deep growl rumbling from his throat, more from exertion than threat. At last he stood, towering once more, though unsteady, his injured paw held above the earth. The man did not flinch, even as the great head turned toward him. Golden eyes locked onto his, sharp but weighted with fatigue. The silence that followed was immense, so heavy it seemed the grass itself paused in the wind. The lion's gaze did not burn with rage, nor did it soften. It lingered, steady and unbroken, as if the space between them demanded recognition. The man held that gaze, neither advancing nor retreating, his breath even, his hands lowered at his sides. The lion gave a low sound, not a roar, but a throaty exhale that shuddered at the edges. He stepped forward, his good paw carrying the weight, his injured one brushing the ground lightly before lifting again. His mane shifted with the movement, heavy with dust and sweat, catching what little light the evening still offered. He limped in a small circle, testing the release, feeling the air move freely around him once more. Yet always his eyes returned to the figure who had freed him. The villagers whispered, some holding their hands to their mouths, others frozen in disbelief. No one expected him to linger. Most believed that once freed he would vanish into the tall grass, leaving nothing but silence behind. Instead, he stood only a few steps from the man, his body trembling from exhaustion, his breath uneven, but his presence unwavering. For a moment that seemed stretched beyond measure, predator and human remained bound in stillness. The lion's ears flicked back, then forward. His chest rose in a deep inhale, then fell in a sigh that stirred the dust. The man spoke softly, almost inaudible, his words no louder than the evening breeze. "Go on." The lion's head tilted slightly, mane brushing his shoulder. Then, with deliberate slowness, he turned his body away, limping toward the open plain. The pause had been longer than anyone thought possible, a gesture not of thanks, but of something unspoken, the acknowledgement of a shared moment between survival and release. Each step was heavy, uneven, but carried forward. He stopped once, halfway across the clearing, and turned his head back over his shoulder. His eyes caught the fading light, glimmering amber against the shadow of dusk. Then he moved on, his figure swallowed gradually by the grass, until only the swaying stalks showed where he had passed. The man rose at last, brushing soil from his hands, his shoulders heavy with relief. Behind him, the villagers exhaled as though they too had been holding breath. The land, once strained with tension, softened into the quiet of evening. The lion was gone from sight, but his lingering gaze remained, not in words, not in sound, but in the memory of how long he had stayed before walking away,